So, good evening everybody, it's a pleasure to be here. If you do feel the urge to tweet at any point, please bear in mind Campbell and my own Twitter handles that you can use. So when I was asked to come and speak here, I felt I had to have a fairly statistical subject, and my knowledge of statistics doesn't go too deep. But obviously meta-analysis is the heart of evidence synthesis. What Campbell Collaboration does is systematic reviews and evidence maps of interventions, both in developed and developing countries, and we'll be seeing an example of such studies as we go through the presentation. But I wanted to start by giving an introduction. I want to start by talking about this slide, sorry. So there's been, as I'll say in a moment, an evidence revolution in development. This evidence revolution is not unique to development. The evidence revolution is something we see across all sectors. And we can see that by looking at a range of books that have come out in recent years. So clearly we know evidence-based practice is very common in health, so here's evidence-based nursing. But we also have evidence-based business and management, so there's an evidence-based business book based on evidence from randomized controlled trials mainly, evidence-based teaching, so we have evidence in the teaching sector, evidence-based art therapy, we have evidence-based social work, evidence-based policing, which actually is very strong indeed, evidence-based training for sports and speed and agility, so we get evidence-based sports science, and we even have evidence-based cooking. If you're familiar with James Wong's book, his evidences, he has in his book the evidence pyramid with systematic reviews at the top, and all of what he recommends from randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews on how to prepare food, like use mustard with your broccoli if you want to really make the goodness inside bioavailable. So evidence really is spreading across all sectors, and this is symptomatic of what I call the four waves of the evidence revolution. And I'm going to talk about this evidence revolution very briefly in the context of international development. I had a paper out in Nature earlier at the start of this year, end of last year, start of this year, that describes this in a bit more detail, which you can happily go through. So here are the four waves. I'm going to go very briefly through each of these four waves that have come out over time. So the first wave goes back to the 1990s and new public management, which was the attempt to bring more business-like, private sector business-like behaviour into the public sector. And it was particularly prominent in Anglophone countries, so in the US, here in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, particularly under Clinton with the Government Results Performance Act in 1993, and here in the UK with the Modernising Government Agenda white paper in 1999 in the Blair government. And what was good about this new development management, the results agenda, so let's focus on results, was shifting the focus from how much money we spend to actually measuring outcomes like unemployment, poverty, empowerment, immortality and so on. Because my first job was an ODI fellow in Lesotho back in the mid-80s in the planning office, and it really was the case then, working with a number of ODA projects, that we were measuring success by the money spent, Land Rovers procured, number of consultants in place and so on. So the shift to measuring things that matter, actually, final welfare outcomes, was a good thing. And this, of course, manifested itself in the international development space, first in international development targets, which DFID was the main agency to buy into, which then got replaced in 2000 by the MDGs, which had more international buying, so they came from a UN meeting rather than an OECD meeting. And then, of course, they were replaced by the SDGs in 2015 when the MDG period expired. And the good things about this was the focus on outcomes, so thinking about what matters, but also, and actually this was referred to in passing in Ian's opening remarks, was the thinking about measurement. And so when we've got the SDGs, primarily the MDGs, we're working a bit towards having a common set of indicators, how we're going to measure progress in a particular sector. And we've not done very well on that in development in general, or in most social sectors. So if you think of psychology, psychometrics is a field in itself. It's a field of study in itself that people, as a career, think, well, how can we measure depression, identify means of measuring depression, validate that instrument in different cultural contexts, and so you have cross-cultural recognised scales for measuring depression or other mental health conditions. We don't have the same across most other intervention spaces that we work in. So if you do a review on, say, social cohesion, there's many outcome measures that are included in studies. because every author study comes with their own measure of that particular outcome, and that's not terribly helpful. They're trying to measure the same underlying construct, but they do it in different ways. So in health, and I'll talk more about how health is ahead later on, in health there's an initiative called COMET, which is basically to establish a set of common core outcome indicators for the health sector. There's a very recent, I mean like 2 weeks ago, initiative in the World Bank to do the same in education, but most sectors don't have something like this. So that was a good thing, focusing on outcomes, thinking about standardising measurement, not going that far with that. The shortcoming of the results agenda was that the name results is a misnomer, and it gives the impression that by measuring these outcomes you can tell us how our agency and our programmes are doing, and of course you can't, because outcome monitoring doesn't tell you how your programme's achieving, because the outcomes for your project group, your intervention group, can vary for a whole host of reasons. Other factors affect outcomes. And so unless you've got some valid impact evaluation design that allows you to say, well, the outcome changed because of the intervention by this much, and the other changed for other reasons, then you can't attribute the outcomes you see changing to the intervention. So what we saw happen in the second wave of the evidence revolution was the rise of impact evaluations, particularly randomised controlled trials. So the first wave was back in the 1990s. Everyone was faffing along thinking outcome monitoring told you what your results were. They then realised it didn't do that, and there's this shift to do instead impact evaluations, so particularly randomised controlled trials. So this is publications per year of impact evaluations, so it includes non-experimental designs like regression discontinuity, statistical matching and so on. And the data comes from the 3IE database. So hands up, who knows what 3IE is? No one? Me? Hugh, you work there, you know what it is? Yes. Okay, so it's International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. 3IE, so it's a global grant-making body to fund impact evaluation and reviews in development space. I used to work there as a founding executive director at 3IE before Campbell. A lot of money from DFID for 3IE. So over the years now, I've lost track, but around must be £50 million or more have gone into 3IE to then sub-grant into studies. And by the time I left 3IE 4 years ago, we'd funded around 200 odd impact evaluations around the world and around 100 systematic reviews, which I'll come to. And so what you see is that back in 20 years ago, there were around 50 impact evaluations a year being published, mostly in health, and then by 2012 over 500 a year being published. So a tenfold increase in impact evaluations. This tail off is not a true tail, it's just an index. This is quite an old graph now. It's just an indexing factor because old Neuralit papers don't get into the databases, into the indexes to get identified. So if you do see the more recent graph, it will continue to grow, this trend. So a huge increase in number of impact evaluations going on. As the body of evidence is growing, we want to base our global advice, the global ideas on what works and what doesn't, and I'll come back to that, on summarising the bodies of evidence. We don't want to be influenced by single studies in a particular context. The most infamous example of that is deworming, where there's a study based in one part of one district in Western Kenya. It says deworming is fantastic and it has huge impacts on not just reducing the worm burden, but on health and nutrition and getting children into school. The Deworm the World movement has taken that study to persuade governments like India, the Indian government, have a national deworming day for school-based deworming programs. And you go to the website of, like in the Bihar deworming program, it will say evidence from around the world shows that deworming improves health and nutrition of children and it helps with school attendance, school performance. That statement is simply untrue. There is a lot of evidence from around the world and it shows precisely the opposite. It shows there's no such impact of deworming on any of those things. There are 12 studies from India itself showing no impact on any of those things. So what we want to do is look at the global evidence base and say what can we learn overall. There is an African exceptionalism for deworming. There are 3 countries in Africa, Senegal, Uganda and Kenya, where there are studies showing positive impact on deworming, but they are the exception. There are more than 60 showing no impact. And so we want to understand the African exceptionalism, but we can't base our global policy on the exceptionalism. We should look at what the body of evidence say, which deworming actually seems to have no effect. So we do that through systematic reviews. Systematic reviews do a comprehensive search to assess, identify and assess the available and summarise the available evidence on a particular intervention or policy or practice issue. And systematic reviews are the third wave of the evidence revolution, with a huge rise in systematic reviews over the last 10 years. Again, the graph's a bit dated, again from the 3i database. So they're around, I think it's around 600 reviews now in the 3i database. So, fewer than 20 a year going on. They weren't really at all there. They got a big push. 3i funded a lot of impact evaluations, not funded by DFID, through 3IE in this period here. And so we see by 2016 over 100 reviews being published in national development. So a tenfold increase again in the number of reviews being published per year. So a big increase in these. So this is all very good. We've got more and more evidence and we want to get it used. But the problem, as we all know, is getting research findings into use, because research reports are particularly unreadable and intractable and policymakers don't like them. That's particularly true of systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are particularly unreadable. People writing reviews go out of their way to be unreadable. So the deworming report is 700 pages long. It's very nice, but not many policymakers are going to read that. So what do we do? Because what we want to do is, in my evidence-driven policy cycle, is we want to actually, this is a simplified version, we want to synthesize the global evidence and consult that to inform program design or redesign when we're changing programs. And there are two ways of doing this. And those two ways bring us to the fourth wave, which over the last 5 to 8 years of knowledge brokering. So the two ways of doing knowledge brokering are customized direct interaction, which I call the Nordic model, but DFID has some in-house knowledge brokers who do something akin to the Nordic model. And I think they do. I never managed to find out what they do, but I know they have some, and this is probably what they do, because I can't think what else they do. And the alternative, which I'm a strong believer of, is building knowledge broking platforms that I call the What Works model. So the Nordic model it takes place obviously in Sweden, Norway and Denmark. And this is for domestic programs, for their own programs in those countries, not for international development. So for health, education and social welfare, they have government-funded research centres. Nothing unusual about that. IDS is a government-funded research centre, for example. So the difference is that the researchers in these government-funded centres do not do their own research to write for publication. They don't publish, not in journals. Their job is to write systematic reviews for government. So they meet twice a year with government departments, agree what are the different policy priorities. They want to reform this policy, look at that practice, do new guidelines on this or that. There's a new problem area, we need to know what to do. They agree what the priority areas are for government, and they say, okay, here's 10 reviews we're going to do over next year. So they produce, the staff go off and do those reviews. Their job is every day sit there and write reviews for government. They do the reviews in a year, give it to government in Norwegian or Swedish or Danish, and then move on to the next one. Don't publish, don't do that, that's not their job. Their incentives are just, I come to work, I produce reviews for government. And that's built in, so Campbell has an office in Oslo, that's built in to the system there. So we've had several seminars with government departments in these three countries. Now when you ask, well, you described the policy process and said, okay, so the minister wanted to know about this, so I commissioned a review. So stop right there. Why do you commission a review? Because if I was in DFID, I wouldn't do that. And they say, but I have to. My colleagues would laugh at me if I didn't commission a review. It's just the way they do things. Yes? And there's something about the political system there that means that politicians, civil servants really do believe in evidence. They really do believe, if we get this from academic community and this is what they say, we have to base what we're doing on what they say is the evidence. So this is a great model, but it's really a great model if you've got national level decision making. Because if you've got a practice that's going to affect school managers or individual social workers or teachers or prison governors, individual NGOs working in developing country, you can't reach out to all of them with customised direct interaction. There are just too many of them. So you've got to find a way of getting your evidence to all of those people to help them do evidence-informed decision making. And so by doing that, we want to have higher level products and what I call the knowledge brokering pyramid to have decisions based on evidence without actually having to go through this direct interaction process. So we do that by what I call, this is the knowledge brokering or knowledge translation pyramid. And so it's not the same as the evidence pyramid with RCTs and reviews at the top. It's not about the quality of evidence, it's about how heavily brokered the evidence is, how heavily the evidence has been translated. So at the bottom, which is not meaning it's the worst, it's actually the bedrock of the knowledge translation or knowledge broken pyramid is data. So data are key, okay? So data underpin the whole system, but data are not evidence. You hear this more and more, people conflate data and evidence. They say, oh, we've got the data, now we'll go and see what works. No, you won't, because they're just data, okay? Data need to be analysed in studies to get to the next stage. So the next stage up is individual studies, but we've learned that you don't want to draw general global policy conclusions about what works from studies alone. You want to do reviews of those studies. And those studies, all of these reviews and studies, can be put into databases. So the 3i database I've mentioned a couple of times is a database of effectiveness studies of international development interventions. So all it has. So it has impact evaluation and reviews of how effective are individual development interventions. So if you were to go to Scholar Google and type in school-based management, you get 4 million hits, because it's all sorts of studies on school-based management. But if you go to 3i database, all you get are effectiveness studies. So someone's been through the Scholar Google results and screened them to say, okay, these ones are the effectiveness studies, and we include those in the database. What you can do, and I'll show you some examples later on, are evidence maps of those data, or make evidence platforms, but most importantly, what I call evidence portals, we'll see some in a moment, guidance and guidelines, and checklists. And the important thing about these are they allow decision makers to make decisions without having to go back and read the research. So all of these take you back to the underlying research. These don't. These say, evidence portals say, here's the evidence, you decide what to do. Guidelines say, we've looked at the evidence, we recommend you do this. And checklists say, we've looked at the evidence, just do this, okay? Don't think about it, just do this. So they're more heavily brokered as you go up the evidence pyramid. And which is more appropriate depends on the type of research and type of question you have. So portals are more like, well, what should I do type things, whereas guidelines and checklists are more like, how should I do it? And so you're much more likely to use qualitative process evaluation data for these, whereas this should be based on effectiveness studies, if it's a what works type portal. Now, what we want to do is to institutionalise use of evidence, all this stuff, into decision making. And the where this works best is in World Health Organization, in health in general. So for example, the World Health Organization do guidelines, WHO guidelines, which countries around the world look at to inform their own national guidelines. So we were trying in Campbell to influence the Indian government, we have also an office in Delhi, Indian government on their deworming policy. They were saying we're going to wait to see what WHO says. And we did manage to influence the WHO guidelines, so they also cited the Campbell Review. Then Indian government changed their guidelines in accordance with the new WHO guidelines. And importantly, this is a quote from WHO guidelines on producing guidelines. And their guidelines on guidelines say our guidelines have to be based on high quality systematic reviews. So institutionalise use of evidence from high quality reviews. You can't just make guidelines up. You cannot do guidelines based on expert opinion. That's what they used to do. They had a review about 15 years ago by a guy called Andy Oxman, and he came saying, no, you have to base your reviews on high quality systematic reviews, and that's what they decided to do. So these are now the guidelines for producing guidelines. NICE here in the UK has exactly the same process. So NICE guidelines are based on reviews, and they also take into account what we call values, and they consult stakeholders about what's practical, but the underlying evidence, any NICE review contains a section of what does the evidence say, based on systematic reviews. That's guidelines. If you remember, guidelines were second from the top, where am I going, in the evidence pyramid. Below that is evidence portals. So there are many, many more of these days, particularly because of the What Works centres. So the last 5-6 years in the What Works movement, have What Works clearinghouses in the US, and have What Works centres here in the UK. There are around 11 of them now. And the most best funded and the best is the Education Endowment Foundation for What Works in England, and they have what's called the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, which I call the best website in the world. Okay, this is a very nice website, obviously, it's the best in the world. And what you have here is a very simple interface where they list 34 different interventions of things you can do to improve learning outcomes. And for each of those, I've done a systematic review. So 34 systematic reviews underpinning the Teaching and Learning Toolkit. And they have 3 metrics. What does it cost? Range of £1 to £5. How strong is the evidence? So 5 locks means lots a smattering review and lots of RCTs, and 1 lock means bleh, not much. And then most importantly, the impact in terms of the months of additional learning outcomes that you get from a child being exposed to intervention. So if you adopt arts participation in your school curriculum, then children exposed to arts participation, it will be as if they had 2 months additional schooling. Okay, because of the cognitive benefits of arts participation. You can sort by this, I haven't done it in these slides, you can sort by this and you can see the most effective intervention, which is low cost, is feedback. So giving a child feedback on their homework, on their tests they do, either by the teacher or peer feedback, is equivalent to eight months additional learning. So huge impact on learning outcomes, and it's low cost. You can reverse sort and you see that repeating a year is very expensive and actually sets a child back by 6 months. So making a child repeat a year actually has an adverse impact on their learning outcomes. So Teaching and Learning Toolkit, check it out, and you can drill down and find out more about the intervention, more about the evidence and so on, but you don't need to, because all you need to know is here. And a study by NAO carried out in 2015, 4 years ago, found that 2/3 of schools in England, this is for England only, 2/3 of schools in England use this to allocate school resources. 2/3 of schools are making evidence-based decisions based on systematic reviews on how to spend their school resources. Not because they've read the reviews, they probably don't know what a systematic review is, but because you have something like this to guide a decision maker based on the evidence. This is the top of the pyramid, but of course the bottom of the pyramid needs to be there to have the top. So we need the reviews, we need the primary studies, we need the data. Of course this is best advanced in medicine. So in medicine you have something called Magic App. So every time a Cochran review comes out, Cochran does reviews in health, they have many, many more reviews than we do. Every time a Cochran review comes out, British Medical Journal does what it calls a rapid rec. So rapid recommendation on a particular intervention. So this is one from last year on prostate cancer screening, and there's actually a weak recommendation against it. Magic App takes the rapid rec and turns it into a decision-making tool, which says, okay, you want to have prostate cancer screening, so if with no screening, after 10 years, 3 per 1,000 men have died. With screening, after 10 years, 3 per 1,000 men have died. So actually there's no impact on risk of death if you have a screening or not. If you do have a screening, then you've got, out of every 1,000 men, 94 get blood in their semen, 67 get blood in their urine, 45 get pain, 19 get fever, and 1 goes to hospital. Okay, so the side effects are pretty not so nice and not that infrequent, but the benefits are not so much. So it's a decision-making tool. Given the data, the doctor can use this with his or her patient, say, well, what do you think? Do you want to have this procedure or not? So the question is, can we have tools like this for international development workers? Decide, okay, I'm doing women's empowerment programs in West Africa, what's the evidence say about the way I can go about that? And it's an online tool or guidance or guidelines to help those programs. We do have something. International Rescue Committee has now come to evidence framework, which is something like that, built on maps and reviews, evidence maps and systematic reviews, but it's a bit complicated. So we often, when I do a workshop or an event of some sort, we had our major conference, annual conference 2 weeks ago, and IRC came and presented this. The program managers tend to find it a bit complicated. Anyway, let's unpack a bit what's in this pyramid lower down. So first, evidence maps. And these, in the way they appear now, have been popularised by 3IE, but are now being done by more and more organisations. So it's a systematic presentation of all available evidence on a particular sector for a particular question. Most of them are effectiveness maps, so what we know about impact. Not what we know, but what literature is out there. So a typical map, we'll see a bit more detail, has interventions in the rows, outcomes in the columns, and in the cells you have studies that you have out there. And we will see a couple of maps in a moment. So there are different product to I've got a mega map there, we're doing it here. They're different to reviews, because reviews tell you what the evidence says. These products simply summarise what evidence is there. As I say, here's what evidence there is. They don't actually summarise it. So here's a picture of a map. This is actually, I'll show you the mega map. So this is the mega map. The mega map has a very broad scope, so it only shows systematic reviews, doesn't show primary studies. And it contains, in this version, got a more recent version with more, 302 systematic reviews on child welfare. So in a map, you're organised by sector and subsector. You can just see the top of the map here. So early child development broken down different ECD interventions, then you have health, education and so on. And here are the different outcomes, again organised into different domains. This was sponsored by UNICEF, so the domains correspond to UNICEF strategy goal domains. In each, these only reviews, in each cell you have a number of bubbles. The bubbles refer to the reviews which have been critically appraised. So we critically appraise the quality of the review using a tool called AMSTAR, which is used to critically appraise reviews. So red means you shouldn't say quality. Red means you have low confidence study findings, high risk of bias. Orange is medium and green is low risk of bias. And so the maps are I haven't got it in these slides, but maps are interactive. So you've got a map up on your website, you can click on the cell, see all the studies in that cell, or you can click on the column heading and see all the studies in that column, and then you can, from that, get a link to the data, link to the summary of the study, and you can link to the study itself. So the interactive maps don't just show you what's there, they allow you to access the literature. So you can click down through the maps to actually access the studies in the map. So you can not only just see where the 200 reviews are, you can actually access the 200 reviews through the map. From this map, so this is the top, this is ECD. ECD is quite populated, health is very heavily populated, health's always heavily populated, education so-so, rest of the map quite empty. So here's the area of the map on violence against children. It's a priority area these days. So child rights, legislative reform, child protection, here are the safety outcomes, virtually nothing. Okay, so based on the fact that we see there's not much in this area in terms of systematic reviews, UNICEF then commissioned an evidence and gap map looking both at the reviews and the primary studies. Because okay, there's no reviews, but there might be primary studies. So here's a snapshot of the violence against children map. And we see, yes, actually there are some primary studies. Again, they've been critically appraised. And so this is showing both reviews and primary studies. So green is high quality SR, orange is low medium quality SR, and then the other green, this one, is primary study, and red is low, oh, where have we gone? High quality. Oh, sorry, that orange is that orange is low, medium quality impact evaluation, so primary study. So there are quite a few primary studies in this particular space we're looking at here on community mobilisation in particular. So you've got 54 reviews and 91 primary studies in that map. That's ongoing, to be published soon. So the evidence maps allow you to see what evidence is there. Of course, what you want to do with the evidence is you want to create systematic reviews. So systematic reviewing is an approach to identifying literature in a comprehensive way, systematic way, and summarising that literature in a systematic way. It's just an approach that can be applied to any research question. So historically, we've mostly published effectiveness reviews, up here, like the effective parent training on physical punishment of children. But you could do associational reviews of correlations, you could do a scoping review, which is like what evidence is out there, a prevalence review, say the prevalence of child sexual abuse in institutional settings. These slides come from the child violence presentation, that's why they're all these sort of questions. And an implementation review, which is more of the qualitative data about the barriers and facilitators to implementing programmes. So this is systematic review. Do not conflate the terms systematic review and meta-analysis, which many people do. So they're different things. Meta-analysis is the statistical technique for pooling effect sizes across studies and analysing the variation in effect sizes. I'll come back to that. Whereas systematic reviews are about summarising the literature in a systematic way. Now, if you're doing a review that includes quantitative data, you should, under certain conditions, which I won't go into, do a systematic meta-analysis of those quantitative effect size estimates or quantitative prevalence estimates or whatever. But you could do a meta-analysis on non-systematically identified studies. It's quite common. In economics, it's quite common. Meta-analysis become quite common in economics, but they don't do systematic reviews. So you put meta-analysis, but not on a systematic set of identified studies. On the other hand, you could do a qualitative review that doesn't include meta-analysis. That'd be perfectly fine. But most Campbell or Cochran reviews fall into this middle area, which is both systematic review and a meta-analysis. So that's what I say on the next slide. Most of our reviews are effectiveness reviews. So meta-analysis, moving on to finally the talk. So it's the average effect size and factors associated with variations in effect. So as we know, you all know statisticians better than I do, that it's not just the average treatment effect that's the most important thing. It's actually the variation in the effect is often more important, more interesting. Why do we do meta-analysis? We want to overcome policy advice based on single studies to resolve debates, and we'll see why in a moment. Pooling evidence helps us overcome type 2 error. Again, I'll demonstrate that. And we want to understand what are the factors that actually explain heterogeneity in effect sizes. So we'll see examples of all of that. So just in a stylistic way, we could imagine, this is what's called a forest plot. So in a forest plot, the vertical line is a line of no effect. If you're using an odds ratio or a risk ratio, 1 is no effect. If you're using what's called a d-statistic, standardized mean deviation, then 0 is no effect. So here's 1's no effect. And we have, in a forest plot, each line is a study. So you've got the average effect size in the middle, and this is 95% confidence interval. 95% normally used. And so if the 95% confidence interval crosses the vertical line, the study would say there's no significant effect of the intervention on the outcome of interest. And here we have 3 studies, each of which individually says there's no significant effect of the intervention on the outcomes of interest. When you do the meta-analysis, you basically take an average effect across these 3 studies. You use an inverse variance weighted average effect, so you're giving more weight to the studies that have more precision. And it's not at all implausible that you might find this. This is the average effect, this 95% confidence interval, so the overall meta-analysis effect size does say, oh, this intervention actually improves the outcome, even though you've got 3 studies, all of which say there's no effect. Why is that possible? How can that possibly make sense? It can make sense if these are underpowered studies, so there's a high risk of type 2 error. And a study published in an economic journal a couple of years ago now, looked at 64,000 effect sizes from economics articles, and it found that the median power was 18%. 18%. So type 2 error, 82%. So if you assume those 3 studies are independent, then you've got a 50% chance of actually getting 3 studies in a row finding no effect when there is one, because the risk of type 2 error is very high indeed. So when you've got such high risk of type 2 error, you're going to find studies finding no effect when there really is an effect, and pooling the data allows you to overcome that risk of bias coming from type 2 error. An example of that comes from the Cochran logo. So this was the logo Cochran adopted when it first started, still has it, and the logo is based on one of the first reviews they did. The intervention is giving a corticosteroid injection to women about to deliver prematurely. Children born prematurely at very high risk of dying, almost neonatal death, perinatal death, and the idea of giving the injection is to reduce the risk of death. So here we have the forest plot, 7 studies. If the line lies entirely to the left of the line of no effect, it means that study found no effect, found it reduced the risk of death of the child. But if the horizontal line crosses the vertical line, that study found no effect. So what would a doctor or a hospital manager say? They say, well, there's 7 studies, 5 find no effect, only 2 find an effect, so the evidence is mixed, on balance it's like it doesn't work. Okay? There is no mixed evidence, there's only incorrectly synthesized evidence. And the correct synthesis of these studies is shown by the meta-analysis effect size, which shows a 30 to 50% reduction in mortality. And as a result of this review, this intervention, which is very cheap, is adopted at thousands of hospitals around the world, and hundreds of thousands of people alive today who wouldn't be alive if this review hadn't been done. Because it's not the fact of the underlying primary research that mattered, it's doing the review and doing the review right that matters to actually summarise what the evidence says. The alternative, so you overcome underpowered studies, we saw that, but also you overcome vote counting. The alternative is often used in literature reviews, which we hate, is vote counting. So there are 5 studies saying it doesn't work, 2 studies saying it does work, so it's 5 to 2 against, so the intervention loses. That is wrong. Okay, you shouldn't do vote counting. In this case, vote counting literally kills babies, because people are alive today that wouldn't be alive if you used a vote counting approach. So you have to use meta-analysis. Okay, resolving debates. So I've got several examples like this, but here's a quote from the data from Time magazine saying that coffee is bad for you, and then here's an article from Time magazine saying coffee isn't bad for you. Here's an article from Daily Mail, Mail Online, saying that coffee reduces the risk of liver cancer. Here's an article from Daily Mail saying coffee is bad for you. So the problem with this, there are loads of examples. The problem with this is that the public and politicians say, well, scientists don't know what to think, they can't make up their minds, so we'll just do what we want. The scientific literature is not clear. The scientific literature is clear. We need to do meta-analysis. Part of this might be because they've got different outcome variables, but let's take the liver cancer one. There is a systematic review on this, and it shows very clearly that drinking coffee does reduce the risk of liver cancer. The scientific literature is clear, has a very clear answer. And what's striking at Campbell is that actually most reviews we've done do come to fairly clear answers, and we'll see some examples in a moment. So forest plots, we've seen stylized forest plots. Here's a forest plot in full related to conditional cash transfers, but I forget what the outcome variable is, you may know. And so each study is an individual, each line is an individual study. Here we name the country and the name of the programme. You can do child labour, impact of CCTs on child labour. Okay, thank you. This is Hugh from 3i who runs the systematic review programme, or set it up many years ago. And so here we see that actually conditional cash transfers do reduce child labour across these 7 studies. Here we have the average effect size, confidence interval, and the weight given to that study in the meta-analysis effect size. So when you have a very small confidence interval, more precise estimate, you see the weight is higher. Large confidence interval, so very precise estimate, the weight is lower. You can change the weighting system. This is done in Stata probably, yes? So then you can do it in Stata or in R. Most programs these days have a package to do the meta-analysis and the forest plots. And yeah, I'll come back to those. So you can do either a fixed or random effects model. Fixed effects model assumes basically it's one true effect size in all programs, and that's what we're trying to uncover. That's very unlikely to be true for our studies because context varies by population, intervention, fidelity, or even design can vary. So it's very likely you need to use a random effects model that assumes basically every study will have a different underlying effect, but you can estimate, obviously, sort of the effect and the variations of effect using random effects. Very often you see high degrees of heterogeneity, and heterogeneity is captured by an I-statistic, and 85% is high, over 80% is high. And you get a rough idea of that by seeing that the confidence intervals don't overlap terribly well. We'll come back to this example. You don't always get heterogeneity. Here's a couple of examples with very limited heterogeneity. So here's one looking at this analysis that Hugh did, looking at the impact of community-driven development programs on social cohesion, and you see basically straight down the line, no effect. Okay, these programs have no effect on social cohesion. This is one case where we don't say more research is needed. No more research is needed. Stop wasting your money. We know that CDD programs don't affect social cohesion. We've got enough studies that show that very clearly. They have other positive effects, but this is not what they achieve. Another example is the impact or lack thereof on employment services, on employment outcomes. This is a review of youth employment programs, and again, pretty straight down the line, a little bit more heterogeneity going on, but not a lot. Over I squared is 0.0%, so no effect there. No program finds, no study finds an effect, and overall meta-analysis effect size is close to 0. Let's go back to the heterogeneity, because what we want to do is understand heterogeneity as well. So one thing we might do is say, well, okay, this is the impact of microcredit on women's empowerment. Overall, very, very weak effect, just marginally significant. Let's look at, though, Bangladesh, because everyone knows about Bangladesh being where microfinance programs were born to increase women's empowerment. And we just take the Bangladesh studies, we see there is an increase in empowerment, whereas the other studies overall, actually, there's just no significant effect. So maybe in Bangladesh it works, but elsewhere it doesn't work. But another form of moderate analysis would be to look by study design. And a consistent finding in reviews is that the stronger the study design, randomized controlled trials being the strongest, the weaker the effect. And you see exactly that in the, sorry, that's showing the heterogeneity. You see exactly that when we look at the low quality studies, high threat to validity, medium quality and highest quality. You see the diamond drift to the left across the different subgroups. And so basically the stronger the study design, the weaker the effect. And RCTs is very clearly no effect from microfinance and women's empowerment. My favourite example of that, it's not a development example, comes from and very little heterogeneity, I squared is 0 in the RCTs. My favourite example of that, so there's the finding, stronger study design, the smaller effect. Favourite example of that comes from a review on custodial versus non-custodial sentences. So someone's done something bad, you can throw them in prison or give them a community sentence, and this is the effect on reoffending. And basically there's no difference in reoffending rates with RCTs, whether you get a prison sentence or a community-based sentence, which is a good thing because community-based sentences are cheaper, keep the family together and so on, and so this would say, well, it's fine to not send them to prison because it won't make them more likely to reoffend. If you look at the propensity score matching, well, it's non-experimental but nearly all PSM, you actually find that non-custodial reduces the risk of reoffending. So non-experimental actually suggests that non-custodial is better than custodial, which is plausible because there's a well-known criminalisation effect from going to prison. Who do you meet in prison? You meet criminals. What do criminals talk about? How to do crime. So you think send people to prison, it might make them more likely to be criminals, but the RCTs say, nah, actually no difference. Why do we believe this, not this? Because propensity score matching is based on observables, and it's not implausible that judges give non-custodial sentences to people they think they won't reoffend, and give custody to people they think will reoffend, and we can't capture all the factors in our PSM that capture why the judge is making that decision. We might not have those data, or we simply can't observe them. Something he gets about the individual and he's doing his sentencing, and so it's likely there's some selection bias going on here that actually explains the effect and not a real effect. It's plausible, though we don't know, but it's plausible. So the authors of the review say, well, we go with this, and Campbell guidelines say you can't pull experimental, non-experimental unless they're saying broadly the same story, which they're clearly not here. You can also do meta-regressions. So they were subgroup analysis, just basically bivariate subgroup analysis. But you can do meta-regression, bivariate or multivariate. This is a conditional cash transfer study where basically they're looking at the log odds ratio of school enrolment and attendance against the conditionality in a cash transfer program. So the authors classified the cash transfer program to 0 unconditional cash transfers to 7-point scale, 6 of highly monitored and enforced conditionality. And if you work back to effect sizes, it means that children living in a community with a strongly monitored and enforced CCT program are 60% more likely to go to school than children living in a community with an unconditional cash transfer. So the conditions matter and make a difference in a conditional cash transfer program, but they matter most if they're strongly monitored and enforced. And this is a log odds ratio, so it's going upwards just in terms of the odds ratio. So it's a very strong effect from having monitored enforcement. We'll come back to that. You can also do a causal chain analysis, meta-analysing effects along the causal chain, and then analysis that Hugh produced. So these are farmer field schools, which are participatory interactive learning programs, normally to reduce pesticide use, to improve farmer yields and incomes. And what we see here is farmer field school participants, those who took part in the farmer field schools. This is the knowledge test scores. Their knowledge about farm practices improved. So good, did the school, knowledge improved. This is farmer field school neighbours. This isn't the comparison group. These are simply non-participating farmers in the same communities. Because part of the theory of change is there will be diffusion effects to non-participating farmers. What we see is actually there's no change in knowledge from non-participating farmers. So the diffusion effects seem to break down at the first hurdle, and we'll see that story carry on throughout. So here's pesticide use. Most farmer field schools are meant to reduce pesticide use. We see pesticide use fall for participating farmers. No effect for their neighbours because there's no change in knowledge. We see the yields. I can see it, you can't see it because it's there. There, now you can see it. There you go. So here the participating farmers, yields improve. Non-participating farmers, their neighbours. There's not a control group, it's neighbouring farmers. Neighbouring farmers, no effect. And then net revenue again goes up for participants and no effect on just about no effect on their neighbours. So you see this consistent study through the causal chain of changing knowledge, changing practice, changing yield, changing income for participating farmers, but for their neighbours. But that holds true in pilot programmes, not when you go to scale. So here the pilot programmes, pesticide use goes down, yields go up. Here is a much smaller evidence base on national programmes, and we see no impact on pesticide use or yields. So the programme seems to work at small scale when you go in pilot programmes. Taking it to scale doesn't seem to be effective. And we have some analysis in the report to suggest why that might be. That's a common finding, not just in developing countries. It's difficult to go to scale successfully. Things work on a small scale, don't work once you go to scale. That's why you need to do efficacy studies and then you need to do effectiveness studies at scale. You've got to do both. Here's a slide that never wants to show. I don't know why it is. Okay. So you can use reviews to dig deeper into implementation design issues. So conditional can transfers, we already saw that the conditionality matters for the increase in enrolments. And secondly, we know that cash transfers work better if conditionality relates to secondary rather than primary education. They're bigger, less frequent payments, and so the condition matters. If we look at food supplementation, then we know that they do improve nutrition, but the effect is bigger if they're better targeted. Clearly, you read less malnourished children, more malnourished children, it's going to have a bigger effect, and if it's supervised to avoid leakage and substitution. So you can, from reviews, get very useful lessons, not about just what works, but about how to design or implement programmes. We do have, in the Campbell Library, 34 completed reviews on a range of topics, and here you can't read it, but it's in the slide pack. I've mapped them against the SDGs. So particularly poverty, the first SDG, we've got a lot of evidence. What I find really surprising, and I call it in a recent blog the scandalous underinvestment in the evidence architecture, is why no agency has actually said, let's just take the SDGs and let's just invest massively in systematic reviews to see what works and what doesn't to achieve the SDGs. They didn't do it for the MDGs, now let's do it for the SDGs. And it's just not happening. We've got reviews here and there. The Cochran Library has 8,000 reviews. Campbell has 160, only 34 in international development. Okay, so we really haven't got reviews on the scale we need them. So I just don't know why. Like particularly the global funds, like Global Punishment for Education, is just not investing in these things. They put all this money into what they call $5 billion GP has to spend on education programs. They say are evidence-based education programs, not a cent on actually improving the supply of evidence to actually inform decision making. It's scandalous. So let's just see a couple of examples. Here's a 3i review, not a Campbell review, where they looked at over 200 studies on education programs. So you see certain things that don't seem to always work, like school-based management, providing materials, learning, teacher incentives, things that seem promising, so they have got some evidence they work, but not universally, and then what works in most contexts, so which is not much. Cash transfers, getting children to school, not on learning outcomes, and structured pedagogy. So not a lot we actually know works. There are things we don't know because they're in blue, not enough evidence, things we might work, we just don't have enough evidence, things that don't work. So a lot more evidence is actually needed at the base of the pyramid. Many more primary studies are needed. There are some things we know. School-based management improves education outcomes, but not in low-income settings. So this is the problem, it doesn't work in low-income settings where we most need it. Farmer field schools do work, but not at scale. We saw that already. Payment for environmental services have very small effects. They're not cost-effective because the effects are so small that they just don't know what worth doing. Conditional cash transfers more effective for secondary, larger payments and so on. But on getting children to school and attendance and enrolment, but not on learning outcomes. Food supplementation works, but better with targeted supervision. Most of those we saw already. So these are specific findings. We have some general findings across not just developing countries, but developed countries as well. Many things don't work. There's something called 80%. Sorry, stop. No, I'm nearly finished. I think 2 more slides. Many things don't work. So we have something called the 80% rule. 80% of things don't work. So 80% of firms fail in the first 5 years across the world. It's a stylized fact. So why would public sector programs do any better? They don't. We just don't know they work or not. But impact evaluations tell us if they work or not. 80% of things don't work. And when they do work, effect sizes are small. So when we say this program is effective in reducing poverty, we mean poverty goes down from 27% to 23%, 24%. That would be a reasonable effect. That would be something you might expect. If you say we're going to halve poverty of this program, that doesn't happen. There's no program like that. There's no vaccine against poverty. The more rigorous study, the smaller the effect you find. We saw that. Positive effects are most likely in pilots, but it's difficult to go to scale. We saw that too. We've seen all of these things in the presentation. And effects are higher, smaller up the causal chains. Like I said, CCTs actually manage to get children into school, but not affect learning outcomes. They get mothers go to antenatal classes, but far less impact on MCH outcomes. So you get larger effects higher up the causal chain. Something I call the funnel of attrition, but I won't go into that here. But I already mentioned there's a failure to invest in the architecture. So a review of education globally, all education RCTs, found around 1,000 RCTs. 3i database has close to 5,000 impact evaluations, including RCTs. The Cochran Trials Registry, which is work in progress, this is in health, has 1.5 million RCTs, 1.5 million, compared to 1,000. Health, 1.5 million, education, 1,000. So massive disparity. Massive underinvestment in evidence architecture. Systematic reviews, ERIC, which is an education research database, has around 1,000 education systematic reviews. 3i database has 700 reviews across international development. Epistemonicus, which is a health database, has 38,000 systematic reviews. 1,000 for education, 38,000 for health. Massive disparity, underinvestment in evidence architecture, all sectors outside of health. So what we want you all to do is join the evidence revolution. Yes, to make this happen across all sectors. And so the question is, where do you fit in? You've got this, here's the evidence revolution, where are you going to join it, decide where you fit in this. There's stuff on the demand side I didn't talk about. I'll talk about that another time. So thank you, that's it. Become an evidence revolutionary today. Visit our website.
A few years ago, when the SDGs were being developed, leading up to the 2015 launch, there was a lot of talk about the data revolution. I have to admit that as I get older, I become less of a revolutionary because most revolutions involve tearing up what you've got.
Right.
And I'm not always sure you want to do that. Sometimes you do, but not always. But I guess a data evolution doesn't sound quite so exciting as an evidence evolution. But the question I have, I guess, is what's the link between the data revolution and the evidence revolution? Does evidence belong in data? Does data belong in evidence? I think we might have different answers because when we talked about the data revolution, what we were talking about was not just the compilation of data, it was using data to compile information, using information, translating information into knowledge, and using knowledge through evidence to make decisions. And so I think both of these two focus on decisions. Having a lot of evidence is not much use if it's not used. And while I think you gave some very good examples of what works, specifically in Scandinavia, in the UK, and to some extent the United States, I'm less sure how well those processes translate directly to the development world. Having worked in many developing countries, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible. I think the capacity of the systems to absorb and use evidence is quite limited. So what can be done? And I think in your paper that accompanies this, you talk about the need for a fifth phase, which I think is partly about big data, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. But I think a fifth or a sixth phase ought to be, how do we translate evidence into action? What can be done? And one of the big questions, I think, one of the things I've learned from 40-odd years of working in development is it's okay to deal with decision makers, but decision makers move around, they change. They sometimes change violently through revolution, sometimes they change through democratic processes. If you can get people involved in promoting their own development, if you can get the evidence in a form which is accessible by people on the ground who are affected and who are the audience or the customers or this is what these are the people development is aimed at. How can they get hold of this evidence and use it? And I'm not sure the language you use is entirely relevant here. Is there a way to do this? And I think it's, 30, 40 years ago, people like Amartya Sen were saying, right, well, it's really important to have an active press as the development. Countries with an active and free press tended to have a much better development process than those that didn't. I'm not sure nowadays it's as simple as that. And social media are very important. But social media also have negative impacts. We have all sorts of examples of false facts, false evidence. So how can we use real evidence, which is based on enormous amounts of data? How can we get that to people in a form which they trust and understand and use? And can use that to promote and force, if you like, the process of development to go ahead. Under the political level, how do we move to evidence-based policy from policy-based evidence, which I think is pretty common in many countries. It's certainly common in this country, having observed the political debate over the last year or so. But even in other areas, it's very difficult. The example in this country of the debate about vaccinations and the fall off in the vaccination rates is, the evidence is overwhelming, and yet it's still happening. So the link I think I would like to focus on is the link between the evidence and the action, and what can we do that, and the links in the development space in developing countries themselves. I think that's probably all I wanted to say.
Okay, that's great.
Howard, I think, because what I'm going to say is at a slightly more technical level, I think it would actually be good if you could respond to what Graham said, and then I'll make my comments, because I think that makes it slightly more seamless.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Graham, so I got two main points, but I missed any. So the first is about data revolution, and I think there's both good and bad things to say about that. So on the good side, for both evaluations and reviews, the opportunity to have more data and real-time data offer a lot of opportunities. So in terms of evaluation, we can think about having real-time data from various sources like satellite data and so on, which complement administrative data, which of course is not always terribly good in many countries, particularly still in Sub-Saharan Africa, which could provide the basis not only for real-time monitoring, but actually building in some sort of more real-time evaluation of evidence. And so there's a move towards, has been for a decade now, adaptive learning impact evaluation. So you sort of do tweaks in program design and learn from it and then tweak the program design again, and having more rapid data that can actually be analysed automatically and giving results makes that a more plausible approach. I mean, I say that, but of course historically we've not been very good at using even simple monitoring data, and so the idea we'll actually use real-time evaluation data is based on an assumption that equalizers will change about the willingness to learn and adapt. The downside about big data possibilities are given by things like IBM Watson that basically say I've got lots of data, I look for correlations and tell you what the evidence says. But correlation isn't causation just because you've got lots of data. Yeah, and so unless the way in which the algorithms operate is informed by understanding causal analysis, which often it's not, then you've got a problem basically. People will come up and say, oh, I found this relationship, this impact, which isn't actually a true impact. The trickier question, I didn't finish on the review side. There's a lot of work going on to basically do real-time evidence synthesis. So basically there's a machine learning algorithm for doing searches that will crawl databases and identify studies that seem, it's machine learning. So okay, you've included these studies in your map, so how about these ones? And currently it's moderated, so it will just say, okay, I've studies I found, I think, match what you've already got. I've dumped them in this file for you to review. But in time, if you trust the algorithm enough, then you could actually just let it do it automatically to update the map or whatever. There's already technology there to machine read tables and extract the data from tables and therefore update the meta-analysis. That's already there as well. So in principle, you can have living reviews updated on a sort of monthly basis entirely by machines. You don't need to have any human element involved whatsoever. And that's coming. And so that's coming now through existing systems. And if Google or someone stumble across it, they'll just do it in a year or two, and we'll be out of a job. Yep. So that's happening. On the politics in developing countries, I entirely understand, and I think, like you, it rests with basically working with civil society to increase demand for use for evidence. So here in the UK, we have Sense About Science. Just very close by. We organised our big conference in London in 2016 with Sense About Science, and they do this Ask for Evidence project where people encourage people to basically look critically at an ad on television or politicians claim and say, what's the evidence underlying that? And we'd like more people around the world, and particularly in media, you mentioned media, but also in social media, say, well, basically, what's the evidence? How good is your evidence for that? Our approach, I think, is slightly longer run, is mainly to work with academic researchers. So we don't, in developing countries, so we don't ourselves usually do directly the reviews or maps we work on. We find researchers in the countries where we think they're most relevant to undertake this research. And it's not just those research become champions for those individual research products, they become champions for the evidence-based way of thinking and doing things. And DFID spends some money on some stupid things like this STEADY project that's starting now, which is basically to get an ODI and OPM to go and tell policymakers how to use evidence. It's going to be totally useless. And the fact is that these policymakers do already talk to academics and researchers, but they're local ones. They have their own trusted source evidence. And I can never become the trusted source evidence on Ghana, but I know the guy who can. Yes, it's not me, it's a Ghanaian. And so I want to work with him or her so that he or she is the one who's, when it's called up by a minister or the president or whatever, says, okay, well, there's a review on this, review on that. And this does happen. So there's a group called eBase in Cameroon that's taken Campbell reviews to the Ministry of Education and said, well, this is what the evidence says from these Campbell reviews, what should we do? And they say, okay, we're worried about school exclusion. This is what the review says works for school exclusion. Let's try that here. Let's do that. And it's happened. And actually, eBase even takes reviews down to the community level and said, okay, here's the problem you've got. What do the reviews say about what might work? Let's try that. So we want more civil society organisations, more civil society actors, which may be academics, but it might be media, doing that sort of thing. So we do what I call the demand side, use evidence activities with decision makers as well. But I think in the end, it's going to come from civil society pressure. And it will only ever be that evidence is one factor in decision making. I don't believe all decision making will have evidence-based. It can't be for political reasons. Take the custodial versus non-custodial. It's just a political fact that certain politicians just say lock them up, just because they want to be tough on criminals. Not, just because that's their political stance, that's their values, and the values will trump the evidence. And there's nothing you can do about that. But at least you're making the evidence available so that people who want to take part in that discussion can say, and actually specifically on that, Pew did some very nice work in the States to combat rising prison populations. They went to fairly right-wing states and said, look, you're trying to exercise fiscal responsibility, but your prison population has doubled in the last 10 years, with the prison budget with it. And the reason for that, they analysed the data coming from the states themselves, and the reason for that is not due to rising crime, is because you've got harsher sentencing regimes. Some of the 10 years ago got 5 years for something, now they get 10 years. And there's no evidence to suggest that actually makes them less likely to re-offend. So what's the point in doing it? And they had those discussions to actually halt a prison building program in one state and bring about a reversal in prison population growth in another state. They had a presentation I went to, and there are 4 states where using this evidence they'd actually managed to bring about change in policy with people you wouldn't have thought would actually be amenable to a policy change like that. So it can happen, and we just have to keep being out there arguing for it.
Right, okay, thanks. So I'd like to make comments in 2 areas. Firstly, about meta-analysis. And and then perhaps a little bit more general, the sort of general challenges for design and analysis, particularly relevant to the SDG indicators, but not only to those. So in terms of meta-analysis, which I'm a great fan of, I have to say, I think it's absolutely the right thing to try to do, but the meta-analysis is only going to be as good as the building blocks you use to construct it. And I think in quite a few cases, particularly in developing countries, the building blocks are not very high quality. I've been looking at the introduction of genetically modified cotton in India, so-called BT cotton.
Yeah.
And there are quite a lot of micro-studies, so there's quite a strong potential for a meta-analysis. There have been meta-analyses of this, but with a lot more heterogeneity than just looking at India. But when you look at the reporting of the studies, so there are a number of studies, a number of these micro-studies. When you look at the reporting of them, you find practically no information about sampling. You find practically no information about non-response to surveys. You find very little information about which controls they've used, because they're always observational studies. You don't really know what their model is that they've used. The geographical coverage is often quite limited. So it seems to me there are a lot of problems with those building blocks. And if the building blocks are not good, then the meta-analysis really can't be very good. So I think there is a real issue there about at least about the way the studies are reported. And my tendency is to think that studies that are poorly reported are often poorly conducted as well. So I think, as well as needing to improve our methods of meta-analysis, we also need to get across the need for reporting and for thinking about these sorts of pretty basic methodological issues which are often ignored. So I think that would be my comment about meta-analysis, but also just thinking a little bit more generally about these issues. I've got three challenges here. Firstly, I think it's very important that we design comparative trials. It tends to be that when you read efficacy studies, they're looking at a particular intervention. They're not comparing different kinds of interventions in the way that, if you look at the history of experimental design, and Fisher said, let's make our hypotheses complicated, we have cross designs and all the rest of it. We look at more than one factor at once. And you don't find that, I think, very often in the literature, in the development literature. So, I mean, for example, your farmer field schools, that would be one possibility. Increased extension workers would be another possibility. You know, let's compare them, not just compare nothing with something, but compare different something. So I think that's one issue that I feel we could do better on. You talked about the need, the problems of going from small studies to scaling up, which I think is a real issue now. Interestingly, it came up in our committee today. But suppose, for example, you were trying to reduce zinc deficiency in South Asia, and you tried to roll out these programs, which might be some kind of food fortification or whatever. Would we be able to monitor the effects of those studies on child growth using the statistics provided by national statistical systems? Because I think that's what we need to be able to do. It's fine to have the small-scale micro-studies, but ultimately we should be able to see some effect in the statistics that are produced by national statistical systems. And when you said there isn't the evidence when you do scale up, I wasn't sure whether you meant evidence from these kinds of national statistical systems. So I think it's an important issue. And then the final one is the age-old problem, if you like, of attributing changes in prevalence to policy changes or to changes in preferences. How do we get round the problem of attribution? And that's obviously solved to some extent by randomised controlled trials, but it's a big problem with observational studies. And just to give sort of one evidence of one illustration of I think a different approach to these kinds of issues. This is these are real data. It's a slightly complicated slide, but what it shows is on here the profit rate for cotton farmers in Haryana, in one of the states in India. And on this side is the rate of adoption of the BT technology. So along here you find there was no adoption of BT technology until 2005. After that you find a very strong increase in the adoption of this technology. So the red dots show that by 2016 it was quite close to 100%. You would expect profit rates to go up. If this is an effective technology, you would expect the profit rates to go up, but when you look at the profit rates, you find actually they've really not changed from before the introduction of the technology. This is in a particular state in India. I don't think it's true in every state, and which again illustrates the need for understanding heterogeneity. But I think it's the sort of ways in which we can begin to understand the impact of these kind of interventions. This is a different form of analysis using administrative data, using the techniques of time series analysis, which have their own problems, but which I think do offer the chance to understand these scaled up versions of effects. So I think I'll just throw that into the mix for you to comment on.
Right, thanks Ian. So so on the first one about study quality, I entirely agree. And so a systematic review, any Campbell or Cochran review includes critical appraisal of included studies, which looks precisely at the sort of things that you're talking about, which is basically poor reporting of a study. And we do say often it might be the studies are poorly reported rather than poorly done, but I'm inclined to agree with you, to be honest. If they're poorly reported, they probably were poorly done. And as you saw us on the graphs I presented, we have subgroup analysis by study quality, and so we do highlight the study quality. And people don't like being told their studies of low quality. The most famous, this Kennedy worming study, was marked as high risk of bias in the first review, and they didn't like that at all and made lots of complaints about it. And so I do believe that actually we can have, as had happened in health, systemic effects through doing these reviews and identifying what are low quality studies, which therefore lead to people adopting better reporting standards. There's been a movement, of course, in health to produce sets of conduct and reporting standards for a whole range of study designs, both RCTs and observational studies. And there should be more of that, I think, in our sectors. I've become, I mean, like you, by doing reviews, very aware of how badly reported many studies are. You just can't find the data you want, or that there are basically things that undermine study validity. So we've done a map on homelessness with the critical appraisal, homeless in developed countries, and basically these studies, even when you've got a study that is well designed, they just have massive differential attrition, because the control group just all bugger off and go be homeless somewhere else. And so there's nothing they could do about that. There's one where they assumed 50% attrition in their power calculations, but it was 75%. And so, in the end, it's a high risk of bias because of and it is always differential attrition, which really kills you. And so at least flagging that, and in many studies you can't actually work that out. Even when you can work it out, they still go ahead and report their effect sizes. If I had that, but here's my effect size. Well, it's not valid anymore. So just be honest about it. On I wrote no, so I didn't agree what you said, but I work out what you said. Yes, on that. No, so actually, yes. So yes on that. So certainly, I agree on comparative trials. I'll say two things about that. So when you do a review, you can be a lumper or a splitter. And a splitter said we want to do very precisely defined review. So a very specific type. So what's the impact of a particular. So in the US, you have these branded programs where people invent a particular program and name it, and you have to market it, and you have to buy it from them. So what's the effect of this particular branded program on a very particular outcome? Whereas a more lumped review would look across a range of interventions. So if programs reduce teenage pregnancy, and look at all the programs reduce teenage pregnancy. There's an outcome-oriented review, or an intervention-oriented review, and then you can compare them in that review. And I think that's more useful to decision makers for precisely the reason you're saying. So I'm a lumper, not a splitter. And what we particularly have the power of is network meta-analysis. So network meta-analysis, you want to compare all the different things, and if you've got comparison between A and B and C, then you can compare A and C as well. using NMA. And so we're starting, our D1 review used NMA. And we haven't got many reviews using it, but there's a lot of where there are a lot of studies and you've got a lumped review, not a lot of potential to use it to make these head-on-head comparisons, even when there's no direct comparison in the literature. I think we'll see more of that. Ideally, it's comparative analysis using cost effectiveness. Very few primary studies have cost data. There are ways using ingredient-based approach to try and introduce cost analysis into your review, if not in the primary studies. We're very rudimentary stages in doing that in Campbell. We're aware of the problem, want to do it, but even at 3IE, it was an effort to get the people doing primary studies to include the cost data even when we're funding them. And lastly on, secondly on data analysis, and it actually maybe relates to this, monitoring to see effects. So yes and no. So I don't believe that monitoring data alone can allow you to see effects, because there are other things going on that explain why you might see those changes. So let's take anemia, iron deficiency or zinc deficiency, then there are general improvements in dietary diversity going on as incomes rise, urbanisation and so on. And so those can explain changes you see in reductions in micronutrient deficiencies, not necessarily the individual programs. We had an example of that in one of my best known evaluations on the nutrition program in Bangladesh, where reductions of severe malnutrition was basically eliminated in program areas, but it was nothing to do with the program. We had exactly the same trend nationwide. It's all to do with basically the Green Revolution investments in the mid-90s, increasing yields, increasing income, increasing calorie consumption at the household level, and severe malnutrition disappearing. And so you can get these trends that can seem an apparent project effect with monitoring data, but they're not. They're not a project effect. But of course, I agree with you that if you do a program taken to scale and is effective, you ought to see something from that, unless there's some real negative adverse trend going on. And so that's why my yes and no there. I think this is rather blunt. So to me, this is a puzzle. It's not an answer. It's a puzzle like, okay, well, why not? So I'd want to dig further down the causal chain, under some other factors are going on. I said maybe this isn't the same in other states, but it's not sharply enough defined, because you've got your averages here by year. So I want to break it down. You've got data at household level, whatever you've got, try and break this down to the heterogeneity within Haryana, but also bringing the evidence from other states. You can use ITS, it's a valid design, but you need more data to run it to say something about it. So yeah, yes, right.
Of course, it is using statistics from natural statistical systems rather than from micro studies.
Right.
I suppose that's
yeah, absolutely. And so I should say something about that. So I mean, Campbell reviews, you set your study inclusion criteria, and if you want to answer an effectiveness question, then you should only include studies that can make valid causal statements. So we definitely do include non-experimental designs using observational data, but they have to have done something like ITS or RDD to make it a valid design around causal effects. We wouldn't include before versus after analysis in being a valid analysis of effects, unless there's some real sharp break where you can say, okay, that's the example I normally use is wells. So you stick a well in a village, the time spent collecting water goes down from 3 hours to 15 minutes. That's because of the well, okay? Nothing else happened to make that happen. You can attribute that based on before versus after data. But that's unusual. If what happened to cholera rates, you can't base that on just before versus after.
okay. Thank you. So I'd like to throw it open to the floor for questions for Howard. Yeah, Matthew.
So I've got first a remark and then a question. About your second to last slide, I wondered if you had your tongue in cheek there. I mean, we only get 80% of projects fail, the effects are small, pilots don't do a scale. I wonder why they don't fund more of this stuff. I'm sure we all know why they don't fund more of this. I just wanted to check that. But then perhaps I could pick up more on this question about national data systems and official statistics, because that's where I'm coming from here. Do your projects work at picking up, does your analysis, meta-analysis, does it work with official statistics data looking at national level or regional level effects, or is it all really what we're looking at here is lots of individual studies which have collected their own data. So I guess my question is, does this have anything to do with official statistics?
Okay, takes a few or one by one?
No,
One by. Okay, so I'm going to answer your first point anyway. So this is to do, of course, with incentives and organisations. And the expression, which is not my own, it comes from Ian Goldman, is we shouldn't penalise failure, we should penalise the failure to learn. And so organisations need to reward failure. And I understand DFID had some rewarding failure or something, lunches 2 or 3 years ago. And IDB's annual report had a big thing on failure and like celebrating or embracing failure. And I think the fashion went away a bit. I wrote a blog called Failure is the New Black. This like 3 or 4 years ago, and I think failure is not the new black anymore. But that's the incentive we need, of course, that people have to say, if you're going to experiment, then you're going to fail, obviously. And you'll try things, they don't work, you try something else. And that's not the culture we have, of course. We have a much more safety-oriented culture in organisations. They don't want to admit to failure. I think it varies from organisation to organisation. I think DFID's a bit more out there than others, like the Commission. The European Commission, of course, doesn't want ever to admit any failure whatsoever. And so but I did a lot of work. I used to be an evaluator. I used to work on macro issues and adjustment and macro modelling and stuff back in the 90s. I did a lot of work for the Swedes, and they love being criticised. Like, oh, tell us how bad we've been, what bad things we've done. So you have different national cultures on owning up to failure. So the answer to your question is currently is no. So basically, at the moment, our meta-analysis is research on studies. So we review what the studies said. We do get questions like this, and I used to dismiss them as I don't understand what we're doing, but actually I think there's a point in it. And as we goes back to the big data point that we had earlier on, Graham made, if we think about the opportunities afforded by the possibility of getting data more in real time and doing analysis based on administrative data, then we could think about basically having in place real-time experiments and then get better analysed in real time. We're not there yet. But JPAD, an ongoing programme on using administrative impact evaluations, which has been going for some time in Latin America, just starting in sub-Saharan Africa. So we should look at things like that to think about how we could do precisely what you're suggesting. It needs, currently needs mediation. You can't just take the data and say, here's the evidence, because that's not my initial point. You need to analyse the data. But we can set up systems that do analyse those data to give us evidence. So I think, yes, interesting research in progress. Actually, I promised I'd mention it because I left a meeting to come here. So I was at the meeting with CEDL Advisory Board. CEDL is Centre of Excellence for Impact and Learning. So it's a DFID-funded programme on innovation in impact evaluation and evidence synthesis. And we've just finished our first set of causal proposals, but the second one, this precisely the sort of thing we should be funding in CEDL. So look out for it. We can fund it.
Yeah, other questions?
Yes, I found it fascinating. Lots to think about the putting it in, and the comments from Graham and Jeff. Well, I just want to pick up on one thing, your evidence maps. I mean, I think maps are great, but there's a long history of, do we trust the map maker?
Right.
And what I wasn't clear was, you said you see what evidence is there, but you didn't say you can't see what evidence isn't there. Getting dangerous into territories of unknown unknowns here. But you see, so in a sense, all of this, and your pyramid demonstrates this fully. You can only move up the pyramid if you've got stuff down below, can't you? So, where do you start? Who defines what goes in building blocks? Lots of questions, political questions in a sense.
Right. So I didn't emphasise, but this is precisely the point. So they are called evidence and gap maps. So show what evidence there and where the gaps are. And one motivation is precisely to identify where these gaps are so you can commission an area. We've been pushing very strongly for research commissioners to use evidence maps to motivate their funding decisions. And there's some movement now from the National Resource Council here in the UK, ESRC maybe, to start using evidence maps for that purpose. But precisely, you need the bottom of the pyramid to build the top. So I had a discussion with GIZ a few months ago now about a social protection map, and they came back to us saying, we want to have the evidence-informed guidelines, but we don't want to fund the evidence. I was like, as you said, but not so politely. And so there is that that struggle at the moment, I think, because people are very taken with evidence maps in the higher levels, but actually don't realise a lot of work needs to be done. This was the last slide on the numbers: 1.5 million trials in health, 1,000 in education. You need to make up that imbalance a bit before you can start doing the high levels properly. But on that, so just back on Education Endowment Foundation, because they are big. So Education Endowment Foundation, if you go back 10 years, people told you, be telling you, oh, you can't do RCTs in education in England because unions won't allow it. It's done at local authority level, so local authorities to coordinate. Now EEF has funded over the last 5 years over 500 RCTs, over 1 million school children, half of all primary schools involved in RCTs funded by EEF. So massive expansion by having funding that's going to, we're going to do this, and teachers now, you can go online and register your school to take part in RCT, and they've got a long waiting list of schools.
I have a question about how the meta-analysis itself works.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have heterogeneity across studies, and then you have heterogeneity across cases, so you show different countries
Right.
might have different conditions.
Yeah.
How does that average effect that you calculate at the end take into account this heterogeneity, or you're just assuming it works itself out in large numbers?
No, so the average is the average, and you have to make a decision as an analyst, is that average meaningful or not? And so, it's precisely when you've got a lot of variation, then the average is not very meaningful. And so you have to make, so sometimes people say, the author says there's too much heterogeneity to actually even report an average, and we've got two studies to do any meaningful analysis of heterogeneity, so we're not going to do meta-analysis. My inclination is always say, at least give us a forest plot. Just give us a forest plot so we can at least see that. And then you don't have to do the average effect size, because we can agree it's not meaningful. So, because clearly, the problem with doing heterogeneity analysis, if you've got 10 included studies and your degrees of freedom are not very large. So that's when your unit of analysis is the individual study. So from the individual study, you've just got one effect size, or you might have some subgroup analysis, men versus women or whatever, and you can do play around a bit with that. And then you code the characteristics of those studies to the meta-regression. What we would like to do more, we've just done a deworming review that does this, is in what's called IPD, individual patient data analysis, because it comes from the health analogy. So you get the original study data from your included studies and basically replicate that study, so you know you're doing it the way they did it, and then pull all the individual data. So rather than having 10 included studies, you've got 20,000 observations, and then you've got a much more powerful data set doing heterogeneity analysis. The problem is, that's a lot of work, but also getting the data. So the deworming, the original review had 63 studies, I think it is, and the IPD has, I think, 14, because they could only get the data and replicate the data of 14 studies. So when they tried to publish it, they got the response, oh, but this is not a sufficiently representative sample of studies to actually know we can learn. It's interesting academically, but in terms of knowing whether the results mean anything, then we can't, we're just not enough studies to know that. But that's an elephant in the room in meta-analysis, and no one ever talks about as far as I'm aware, is that we meta-analyse the effect size from the studies we have. And we find, and we do, research grade literature and all that stuff, we're aware of publication bias, but in the end, we've no idea at all whether the studies we have are a representative example of that population of interventions. And it's not at all implausible that the better ones are the ones that get evaluated, even because just doing impact evaluation makes you design the program better. And so there's quite likely a positive bias across effect sizes. Even though nothing works, it's still a positive bias in saying that it does.